Pennsylvania has the most inequitable school funding of any state when comparing funding for poor versus wealthy districts. This graph ranks the 50 states based on the ratio of per-student spending in the poorest versus the wealthiest districts in the state. In Indiana, the poorest districts get 17% more funding per student than the richest districts, which helps provide the extra resources that poorer students tend to need for successful learning. Other states give smaller funding boosts to poorer districts, and in many states, richer districts actually get higher overall funding than poorer districts. But no state has worse inequity than Pennsylvania, where rich districts get 33% more funding per student than poor districts, nearly double the gap of the second worst state. In part, Pennsylvania's inequity is explained by the relatively low proportion of public school funding provided by the state as opposed to local revenue. While many states provide over half of public school funding, Pennsylvania provides only 34%, with nearly all the rest coming from local sources, primarily property tax revenues, which vary greatly based on local wealth. But that's only part of the problem. This talk will focus on the other part, how Pennsylvania distributes the state portion of funding dollars among its 500 school districts. First, the good news. In June 2016, Pennsylvania passed into law a fair funding formula that specifies an equitable way to divide up education funding dollars. It takes into account many factors about each district, including the number of students, how many of those students live in poverty, how many are English language learners, and how sparsely populated the district is, among others, to calculate the relative needs of each district. This formula was unanimously agreed to by a bipartisan legislative commission and is widely viewed as fair. Now the bad news. Only 6% of state funding this year goes through the FAIR formula. The law specifies that the first $5.4 billion of funding, which comprised 94% of this year's state allocation, must be distributed in exactly the same unfair way that it was distributed in 2014, before the formula was enacted. This graph compares each district's actual per-student funding this year on the vertical axis with its formula-based fair share of funding on the horizontal axis. Each dot represents a district, and the dashed line represents fair funding. If all the funds were distributed by the FAIR formula, every district would fall somewhere on that diagonal line. Instead, we see many dots above the line, which are districts getting more than their fair share, and many dots below the line, which are districts getting less than their fair share. You can see that most districts are quite a distance from the line, meaning they are getting substantially more or less than the formula says they deserve. This is disturbing, that some of our students get way more than their fair share of resources, while others get far less. But what's even more disturbing is the pattern of which districts tend to get more or less funding. Here is the same graph, but with the dots shaded according to the proportion of each district's students who are white. You can see the clear trend that whiter districts tend to be above the line and darker districts below. The trend is even clearer if we use just two colors, yellow for the 250 whitest districts and brown for the 250 least white districts. Most points above the line are yellow, meaning whiter districts getting more than their fair share of funding, and nearly all the points below the line are brown, representing less white districts getting less than their fair share of funding. To quantify the difference race makes in funding, we can sort the 500 districts in order from least white on the left to most white on the right. So as you move from left to right, you're moving from the least white district, Chester Upland, whose student population is just 2% white, to a bunch of districts on the far right of the graph whose student populations are 100% white. The size of each dot represents the number of students in the district. The vertical axis shows funding inequity, defined as the difference between fair funding and actual funding per student. Districts below the zero line are getting less than their fair share. Districts above the line are getting more than their fair share. You can see the clear trend that as districts get whiter, moving from left to right in the graph, they get increasingly more compared to what the formula says they deserve. To measure how much more, we divide the districts into 5 bins or quintiles by racial composition, each shown in a different color. Each bin contains the same number of students. Now we can compare the average funding inequity in each bin, and the trend is very clear. The whiter the district, the more generous funding they get compared to what they deserve from the state. Here are those 5 bins in a bar chart. The least white districts get, on average, over $1,900 less per student than their fair share, and the whitest districts get, on average, over $1,900 more than their fair share. And the trend is consistent across the whole range of racial composition. It's not just the least white districts that are affected by the pattern of racial bias. Rather, even average or majority white districts tend to get more funding the higher their percentage of white students. And this trend is uniquely correlated with race. If we look instead at poverty and examine the average inequity at different poverty levels, we find that the poorest students are getting shortchanged an average of $1,500 per student. But we don't see a clear pattern across the whole spectrum of poverty levels as we did with race. In fact, the wealthiest districts are getting about their fair share from the state. Middle-income districts are faring much better, and it's only the poorest districts, which by the way are overwhelmingly less white, that are slammed with dramatically less than their fair share of funding. So how does this funding inequity affect individual districts? Here's one example of 2 somewhat poor districts in western PA, East Allegheny and Titusville. The yellow bars show each district's actual funding this year. The purple bars show their fair share of funding according to the formula, and the green bars show the difference, or funding inequity. The formula says that based on their needs, they both deserve around $5,000 per student of this year's state funding. But East Allegheny, a racially diverse district that is 61% white, is getting just $3,600 per student. Titusville, which is 94% white, is getting $6,800 per student. These are two districts with nearly identical financial needs, yet the whiter district is receiving $3,200 more for every student than the less white district. Here's another example, this time of 2 fairly wealthy districts. The formula says their fair share of this year's state funding would be around $1,400 per student. Upper Merion is getting about $600 per student, $800 less than their fair share. But Southside District is getting a whopping $8,600 per student, a windfall of $7,200 over their fair share. And by the way, Southside is 99% white, while Upper Merion is 59% white. Here's an example of 2 districts that, despite vastly different needs, are getting the same level of funding from the state, about $3,500 per student. Penn Trafford is a wealthy district, 96% of whose students are white, with median household income over $70,000 and fewer than 10% of students living in poverty. Wilkes-Barre's average household income is about half that of Penn Trafford's, and about 41% of its mostly minority students live in poverty. Wilkes-Barre's fair share of this year's state funding would be around $7,000 per student, and Penn Trafford's $1,200. That amounts to over a $5,000 per student fairness gap between these 2 districts. We need to change the flawed narrative about education funding in Pennsylvania. We hear that Pennsylvania has implemented a fair funding formula. Yet that formula currently applies to only 6% of state funding. Current law locks in the historical inequities in the rest of the money forever. We hear that putting all state funding through the formula would decimate many districts. But decimate here is a code word for eliminating the unfair windfall these districts have been getting for decades. There are common sense ways to gradually transition to fair funding so that no district suffers drastic sudden cuts. Finally, we hear, we can't harm some districts to help others. This attitude is based on a flawed assumption that the status quo is the basis for measuring harm. But harm is getting less than you need, not less than last year. All students are equally deserving of adequate education, regardless of what their districts got in the past. Pennsylvania needs to distribute all, not just 6%, of its state education dollars through the fair funding formula.